in. There we go. All right. Well, again, welcome everyone. Welcome, Noel. Thank you for joining us. I'm gonna pin us to the stage, and I would love to ask you to give us a quick introduction about you, who you are as a person and as a community builder. What types of communities have you been a part of in your career?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to do this session. This is one of my favorite topics to jam on, and I'm always just excited to see some new faces too. Amanda, Kari, I'm not sure if I'm getting that right. Jessica, I'm happy to see you all. So I'm Noelle. I am in upstate New York, depending on your perspective. Some people would say I'm not very far upstate, but I am in the middle-ish. And I have been in the community space for about 8 years. I pivoted into community from public education. So I used to be a high school teacher before I worked in this industry, which it informs a lot of my career, which I think kind of sits at the intersection of community and education. So what I'm really interested in is sort of building depth engagement programs and education programs in communities that sort of build over top of your bog standard community support instance. So that's probably what you hear me talking about the most. And the two, I guess maybe three experiences that have informed that the most. I started my career at a company called Teachable. I ran their community programs for about 4 years, community for entrepreneurs that was sort of like building the practice around online course software. Um, and I'll give examples of engagement strategies I used there when we talk through in the panel. But I think what's important for you to know for now is that that was a customer retention program. So it was a program that was available for customers, and we were really trying to keep them and keep them successful. I also worked at a company called Comsor, where I built education programs sitting on top of a community for community builders. If we've rubbed shoulders in the past, it was probably there because it was a community for community builders. And then for the last couple of years, I've been doing independent consulting with some big companies and some really small companies. And I tend to kind of work with them on stuff like this, building community content strategies. So I will zip it and we'll move into the panel.
No, this is amazing. I think having a little bit of an understanding into your background and like the types of work you've been doing, because community work can be so broad and context really matters, right? Because it's very different in an NGO, it's very different in a corporate setting, it's very different if you're the only person running the community activities, right? So I think context is great, and we love to learn a bit more about our amazing speakers. So we appreciate you sharing your experience as well. Before we hop in, I would love to start with the question around like community content. When I say community content, what comes to mind for you?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that are sort of important for me when I talk about community content to differentiate. One is that I think when people hear the word content, they're immediately thinking like formal stuff. So they're thinking like blog posts, books, courses, really like set in stone outbound stuff. And I think when we talk about content in the context of a community, we have to kind of be a little bit more loosey-goosey or maybe flexible with what content is, that it can be everything from like a conversation starter and a discussion that's happening in your community all the way up to that more formal workshop that you might be hosting in your community, and stuff in between, like what we're doing right here. I would classify this as a piece of community content, building a Q&A for your audience. So I
Mhm.
think one way to kind of hold that all in a container is to just think of content as like the feature set or the value that you're offering in your community. And another thing that I would add to that is that it should be user generated as well. So that's another big tweak, is thinking instead of like, oh, content means things that I broadcast to my members, content in communities means also things that they create for you. And ideally, that you then maybe pull from the community and send into your outbound channels. That's totally fine. But there's sort of like a circularity or a bi-directionalness to it that I think makes community content a little bit distinct from other usages of that.
Hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. I think that's a great definition, and I love that you kind of brought us down a little bit from thinking about the big things, right? The ebooks, the blogs, the articles, etc., to like those little pieces of like everyday content that happens, in the community on daily basis.
Totally.
Um, yeah. All right. Well, let's hop into the questions. We also got a bunch of questions and registrations that I'm gonna kind of keep for our Q&A at the end. So if anyone also from our audience today has a question, feel free to pop it in the chat. We'll make sure to get to it in our Q&A session at the end. So when we think about community content, I feel that it's quite unique to all the other like types of content that are out there. I think you mentioned there is that element of also users creating it, but it's not just like blogs, events, and ebooks, right? What is that like unique piece to it? And how does it overlap and how it diverges from like traditional content marketing?
Yes. The unique piece to it, just to be like really direct, is the purpose. So, and part of
Mm-hmm.
my perspective on this is when I worked at Teachable, I actually sat under the brand and content team. So I ran the community, but my peers were um, editorial writers who wrote for the blog or wrote for the newsletter. My peers were social media managers, and their content, the purpose of it was to generate leads. So when they created a piece of blog or newsletter, what they were trying to do is maintain a connection with somebody later on that would then build into a funnel and into a sale. Like I mentioned, though, at Teachable, I was working with an audience who were already customers, and my objective was to keep them customers. So that purpose for content starts to sort of lose meaning in that context. It doesn't really make sense there. So my purpose there was to basically create skills, right? I'm creating content for them to, I want them to engage back with the content so that they're taking off some of the effort that I'm putting into creating it and kind of co-creating value together. And B, I want them to actually reach an outcome with the content that is like measurable for me in terms of their retention with the business. So I would think about it like that.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I would add to that, though, is one of the fun things about community is it tends to really differ what our business outcomes are depending on what part of the business we're working in, or even just like from one community to the next. So what I just said might not apply to you at all. The community that you're building might be a thought leadership community where you really care about SEO, like you care about people finding the community on the internet, or you care about people coming into the community as a lead. So you might be more aligned to that sort of content marketing side than what I just described. But I would just try to always think about hearkening back to business goals with what you're creating content for.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think the purpose as the big differentiator is super important, right? Like, I think that you can also have like secondary purposes and like these like lucky outcomes, right? But the core should stay the same. And I think in community, it is to provide value, right? And it is like then linked to that team, as you mentioned, that you work on and what that value should look like. Um, do you think that there are like any specific goals or intentions with community content that really don't apply to other content types, like, specifically like marketing or any other types of content that we tend to create, maybe like customer success content, etc.
Hmm. I guess on the micro, yes, because in communities we might have slightly different, I'll say like leading indicators, like little metrics that we're looking at. We might be looking at, I want X% of my members to be engaged every month. And maybe our content, we're gearing towards trying to solve that. But I think on the macro, usually there's some overlap with what another department is doing. So for example, I talked about retention. That might also be an outcome of like a customer success case study, right?
Hmm.
So there's a little bit of hand holding there. Same thing with if I wanted to create a piece of content that was bringing people into the community for acquisition, that overlaps with what a content marketing team would do. So I actually would encourage community builders to try to not view community as so radically different from what your colleagues are doing, just because it helps you make a stronger case and a clearer case for your work, in my experience.
Yeah, and you're so right. We actually had a conversation with the community team from Zapier last week, which is available
Amazing.
in our event library, and we were discussing how they collaborate with each other within their community team and with other teams. And I love that you mentioned exactly that because I think collaboration then on the content is you can create it with a bit of a different purpose, but then collaborating with other teams to make sure that you can enrich that content as well as get it to more viewers, right, or more attendees, etc., etc. That's the magic, right? And I think the magic happens in community in uncovering those different opportunities, right, that you can have for that collaboration. So I'm so glad that you mentioned that.
Was that
Amazing.
with was that with Rachel Silvano that came in?
Yes. Yeah, yeah,
Rachel is like my bestie in the community space. I love chatting, so I'm
yeah.
happy to hear
Amazing.
aligned
Yeah,
view.
yeah, 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 yeah. They were, yeah, it was such a great conversation, and it was so wonderful to hear how they are thinking about. Yeah, I think what I really took from it was like as a community, as community practitioners in our organization, we're constantly uncovering those opportunities to collaborate, right? That cross collaboration, not like putting ourselves in a special bucket, but actually like making sure that the community truly lives and breathes through all the other teams. And I think with content, that's super special, right? Because you can find those great customers you want to do those case studies with in your community, right? You can find those great speakers for your events in your community, right? Those super users, those product enthusiasts, again, can come from the community. So I think it's super, super connected. Um, well, let's hop into creating a content strategy, right? We're starting from scratch. We are maybe running a community or we're starting a new one and we want to be super ready for 2025 and say, hey, we want to create a really strong content strategy. What types of content do you think are the best for my community? And how do I know? Like, how should I, when I have a blank canvas and I can do all these different types of content that we talked about, posts and events and all the other written, verbal, voice content, how do I know what's best for my community and where do I start?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think this is another like problem of the community space is that community is very broad. So we have a ton of options. And sometimes one of our biggest strategic challenges is reducing what we're choosing. The shorthand that I usually use for people for like a starting point, if I was working with a client on this, that kind of helps people understand this is thinking about content cadences first. So what I mean by that is think about what's going to happen in your community on a day-to-day basis, what's going to happen on a weekly basis, what's going to happen on a monthly basis, or maybe a yearly, quarterly basis. Think about the different roles that those pieces of content will serve. So, and who they might be for. So, for example, the kinds of things that are happening day to day, like me making an announcement in the community, me asking a one sentence question within the community. That is kind of there for people who have already logged in. That kind of stuff is not really going to convince a person who has never opened your community of the value of the space, but it is there to give something to kind of chew on or engage with to somebody who has opened the space and is like, what's going on here? Especially if there's no engagement being seeded by other members. So on that side, we have these like super low effort, frequent, but also for that already invested member. And then on the side of our more maybe like what we're doing right now, you're not going to do a Q&A every single day. You're maybe going to do it a little bit more infrequently, but this might be something that somebody would see maybe in their email, in an email reminder. They've never opened the community and they see, oh, there's an event happening that I'm interested in going to. Let me pop over to that. And then maybe while they're there, they open up the community and start to participate in those chats. So maybe you kind of see what I'm getting at here is that it's not important that you do every single different type of content, but it is important that you think about, do I have something for the people who are opening so there's something for them to do? Do I have something for people that need a reminder to come into the community? Do I maybe have something also to convince someone who's really skeptical? So what we're doing right now, a Q&A, actually might not be enough. But Clara, do you do a summit or some kind of much more high, I should have checked this before I asked you on the spot, but you're nodding, which is a good sign. Like really kind of high effort, put together events that someone's like, oh, I wasn't convinced by anything else, but like this one time a year, I'm going to come in here and do this thing. That's serving a different role than what we're doing together now. So that's how I would think about community content, is sort of like proliferating balance
Mm,
categories.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's a great way to think about it. And the way you phrase those questions from what happens, like what happens or what do you want to happen on those individual cadences, and then looking at it through the members' lens, right? Like, all right, if I'm already there, what am I getting, right? If I'm not there often, I should be reminded. How should I be reminded, right? I think that's super, super helpful. Um, in what ways do you feel like do like different types of community content like engaging or educational versus like that sort of like social content play
Mm.
a role in the overall strategy? Like, is there a balance between the three? Can I only have one type of content, maybe just educational and no engagement? What is your kind of look on that?
Yeah, I'm gonna borrow. Maybe you've had Bree Lever or Tatiana Figueiredo in here before, have you?
No, I know that Brie is in our community. I don't think we've done
Okay.
a conversation live
So
though.
Bree and Tatiana are both also community strategists who I like to talk to and kind of build out my thinking. And I've learned from the two of them and really have come to believe in this idea of the community to connection ratio. This is a Tatiana thing, so I want to credit her for that idea. And the basic idea is that most communities have some combination of both community or connection and education. So there's some degree of I'm here because I want to connect to this other person. There's also some degree of I'm here because I want to learn this piece of information. But it could be drastically weighted to one side. So you could have a community where vast majority of the value is coming from courses and there's like the lightest touch of conversation. Maybe there's no forum and there's only questions being asked during the workshops, right? And on the flip side, you could have a community where the connection is really, really strong and it's all about that kind of social vibe and there's very light touch of content. And what I think is important is not trying to like control the balance so much as knowing what it is and being honest about it. So what I would not want to see a client do is build a community where it is really focused on education, really light touch connection, but they're marketing it as this is a space for making friends. And then people come in and are like, what the heck? There's no conversation happening here. But if people come in and they know this is what's happening here, they're not going to be worried about the kind of level of conversation. So I would think about that in terms of like, what is the value that I want to offer? And also what have I validated that my customers want is maybe another aspect of it.
What is like that initial promise when they hear or read about the community, right? Whether it's through a web page or they get an invitation from the community manager or their sales rep or whoever, right? And does that reflect that initial visual? Does that reflect what is actually happening in the community? And I
Yes.
think it's okay if the community is super educational, like you said, or very, very social, very, very friendly, right? They're there to make connections or there to learn from each other. But you have to be transparent about it.
Yes. And
Mm,
I think
mm.
this is like a lot of what I do when I'm consulting with people is help manage expectations of like I have a lot of clients who will come in and they're like, I'm so nervous that no one is talking in my community. Or I'll tell you a story. Like I actually had a client where when she was first getting her community started, this happened to her, but she had tons of educational resources. And I was like, okay, let's like check that. Let's check whether that matters. So I had her do some, user research calls with some of the members in her community, they were all perfectly happy with what they were getting in the space. So sometimes our perception of it's not chatty enough in here just like does not match with what our members actually care about. So always check before you freak out.
I think a lot of us on this call, and I can see a few claps as well, just took like a very deep breath. A lot of us exhaled, saying, "Okay, it's okay if it's not that chatty. It's okay if it's also about the education, and it's okay if people just lurk and just hang and learn and take what they need." I think we all needed to hear that today. Yeah, amazing. You chatted a little bit about cadence and looking at things, daily, monthly, yearly. How can we know when we're planning our content strategy? We kind of see like, all right, what are we selling the community as? What do we want to add in there? How can we think about cadence from more of like a practical way? Like, should we track things somewhere, right? Should we experiment? How can we, I think cadence is really crucial in community. I think that kind of comes consistency is kind of crucial. How can we think about that rhythm, and how important is that rhythm for the community?
Yeah. I think there's two ways I would think about this. I'll give you like a really um prescriptive way to think about this. So like if you're coming to me and I knew nothing about your community, I probably would say bare minimum try to have like three sort of day-to-day low effort engagements that you're doing per week. One weekly ritual could be something like this, could be something text-based, and then at least one what I would call like showstopper happening in your community either each month or each quarter. And all I mean by showstopper is like something that someone would see in their email and be like, I definitely want to open the community for that. And what that actually is a point of research for you to do with your community members. So you have to be kind of thinking about it in terms of communities present a lot of friction. What is something that is so good to my members that they will undergo friction to get it? So you have to ask that question. But yes, if you're like leaving this session thinking, what do I actually do? That's what I would plan. Like set yourself up a spreadsheet, or you can crib one of my templates. And I have some spreadsheets on this where you can enter some of those cadences. The
Hmm.
second way that I would think about this, though, in terms of like the larger question of how regular is right for my community. So sometimes people will be like, should I be talking to them every day? How much is too much, et cetera, et cetera. You always want to think of yourself as the community builder as modeling what you want to see within the space. So if we're doing that, we're really trying to match the cadence that we want them to embody. So in other words, if I want my community members to be engaging in the community very frequently, multiple times a day, sort of like a chat style community, that might be a space where I have to do that kind of engagement within the space. On the flip side, though, I've worked with some community builders where their target sector is very busy, and maybe they only want them coming in like once a week and just getting a really quick outcome. Then model that in your engagement cadence. So it's not going to be exactly one-to-one in every single community.
Hmm. Hmm. I like that. We had a quick question that I thought we could kind of quickly insert here because there has been a lot of conversation in our chat about showstoppers. And I like the way that you described how you can really think about the cadence, how you can plan it out, but also, again, from like that experience, is that community going to be more about building connections? Is it more education that you're sharing? How can you kind of map that out? And Amanda asked us in the chat if you could give us an example or two of a showstopper. What could that be? Or maybe in your past communities, what did that look like?
Yes. So I think the classic example of a showstopper, like the thing that I would most readily reach for in the most communities, would be a highly desired event. So, and generally that would be with an expert that the community members really want access to. So an example, even in my community, I have a community for some of my clients that's sort of like holding space for them. Something that might be a showstopper for them would be like me bringing in somebody who's an expert on driving paid ads to community, because that's something that I don't personally do that is like a hole in what I can offer them and that they would really want and otherwise have to pay for, right? So that might be something that they would really love to see and open the community for. But I also want to just highlight that these can really differ depending on what motivates the community members. So in some communities, the showstopper might literally be that you're doing a monthly coaching call with the founder. So if I think about a community like Atlassian, like a big software company where the members are super engaged in the product. They feel really connected to helping drive the product vision. For them, a showstopper might be like the product manager of this aspect of the product that I really care about is going to come in, and I get to talk to that person directly and tell them what I think about the product. So that's why I mentioned this is like a point of research that you'd be looking for the thing that your members really care about. But those are two examples that kind of come to mind.
Yeah, but what I'm getting is that it's something that happens once a month, is a little more exclusive. It's maybe live, or it's like a special, if it's not live, maybe it's like a special type of gated content that maybe the community gets for free, right? That sort of thing. Um, to give an example with content, actually, what we do with our community whenever we release a new ebook on our website, we release it a week earlier in the community, and we already like
Mhm.
publish the PDF, so you don't have to like go to our website, download it with your email, and like fill out the form. You get the resource directly. So, for example, that would that be a showstopper in your
Yes.
parameters?
Anything that, I mean, I guess the
Hmm.
question, if you feel that when you do that is getting people
Hmm.
to open the community, like that's the purpose
Hmm.
of
Hmm.
Stopper. So
Yeah,
if it's
yeah.
doing that, then yes. I mean, it could even be that you're like every month you're offering a discount on a tool that they use
Hmm.
and they have to go into the community to get it. It's another way that I sometimes like to frame this is like dropping the golden key. Like you've ever played a video game and you have to go around the map and look for the key. You want that thing that they really want to be in the community and they have to go into the community to get it. Because the
Hmm.
goal is they're in the community for the showstopper and then they like ride a water slide back into the community and start interacting with one another, creating content, etc. So there's a circularity there.
Hmm. Yep, yep, absolutely. Well, we already have thought about the cadence. We thought about the types of content as well. Before we start truly like writing our content strategy, like put pen to paper, build out our calendar, etc., we should also think about the purpose of the content and, of course, how we want to measure it, right? How we want to measure it, maybe how we want to test the content, if it's even working. What metrics have you found that were most valuable when measuring the impact of content, like especially community content?
Yeah, so I think there's two levels to this. One thing that's really important to me in any community is that I have at least one North Star metric that connects directly back to um, money. Sorry to say it. Sorry to bring it up, but and so what that might be is I talked about how with Teachable, that was
Mm,
like, does this community retain members? So I might be looking at um, churn. Like I might be looking at, do community members churn less often than non-community members? Or I might be looking at, do they have a higher lifetime value? In another community, I might be looking at, does this community generate more qualified leads than another outbound channel? And then do they convert on a higher level than some of these other outbound channels? But in general, you want to be able to sort of be looking at something that has a dollar amount attached to it so that you are looking at ROI, frankly. um, and what that has to do with content is that
mm,
that's ultimately the needle that we're trying to move. So then when we're putting content into a community, we're sort of making a hypothesis that this content is going to impact retention or this content is going to impact acquisition. So I think when we're measuring the more kind of small level stuff, that's why I said this operates on two levels. There's like the top level business metric, but then there's also what am I seeing happening in my community? Like, are people attending this event? Are they responding to this piece of content? The way that hypothesis operates is that when they respond more, that's going to impact the top level business metric more. So we want to kind of first be measuring those like leading indicators. Is the content effective at all? Is it engaging at all? But then also, is it impacting the larger business metric? Happy to kind of dig into that more. This is like a huge topic, so I feel like
It
it's
is.
hard to give a overview of
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great overview. And maybe before we hop into kind of testing and what would maybe measuring that look like measuring kind of, the different experiments look like, what would you say are maybe some like examples of like very community specific metrics, like daily active users, number of comments, attendees, number of blog post visits, kind of like the usual things that we always hear about, the usual activities that members do in our community on a daily basis. What is that journey to ROI? How can I connect that with content? And can I like translate it to ROI in any way?
Yes.
And that's a big
Yeah.
question. So, like,
Yeah. So I'll address the first part first, which is some of those, I guess we would call them engagement metrics. So there was a period in the community industry where everybody was calling them vanity metrics, which I think is a little snarky because they do matter. It matters whether people are engaging with the community. It's just important to remember that's like the beginning of the path and not the end of the path. But where they become really important is cohort analysis. So I've talked about this a little bit. Like that is the core way that you're going to prove ROI full stop, is just comparing a group of people that are in your community to people that are not in your community. So I might say like people that are in the community perform better on XYZ business metrics than people that are not. That's the core version of it. The way that it connects into content is that you can create more granular cohorts, right? So then I might be able to look at, oh, actually, everybody who attended my weekly Q&As, like I've looked at the cohort of people who do that more frequently, and they churn way less often. So that might be an indicator to me that that's a really important piece of content for meeting my business goals, and that I want to accelerate that program, or that I want to try to broaden the reach of that program. Like maybe a simple tweak would be, I'm only offering it during one time zone and I have an international audience. So I'm just going to offer it in two different time zones and see if I can
yep.
improve business metrics. So it's little things like that where you're trying to kind of take the top level metric and just like granularize it a little bit.
Yep, yep. I feel like you have pretty much painted this formula for us where we take a group of community members and a group of non-community members. We look at that one metric, like it could be that sort of, I don't like to do air quotes, but that sort of vanity metric, like that the engagement metric for one group, the other group is missing that. And we look at, all right, why did that engagement happen? Was it a piece of content? Was it an event? Was it a gathering? Was it an article we shared, etc.? And then we look at, all right, what is the question I need to answer to the team that I'm working with? Is it product? Is it marketing? Is it sales? And then how can I link that? What's the two differentiators between the two groups, right? And that's pretty much, I feel like the formula you have painted for us on how we can measure this super simply.
And
Amazing.
acknowledgement that doing this is never as simple. I'm like, oh, you take the cohort and then blah, 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 like you compare it to the other one. I a lot of times what I realize is missing for people in this is that this information is not going to be solely available in your community platform. So your community platform tells you nothing about whether people are churning on another product, like, or it may not capture all of your business metrics. So it's just important to keep in mind that to get to the point where you are actually painting a meaningful picture of your entire business, you have to like exit the community platform itself and do a deeper level of data analysis. So acknowledgement that it's not that simple. It's not going to be like, oh, I clicked a button in Circle or Mighty Networks and it told me this, but it's maybe
Mhm.
like 2 steps away from that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's our job as our platform. That's exactly what we do. And it's usually for all of our analytics templates. It's super simple, and it's actually one of the first charts that you get is different comparison for members and non-members. That's the first thing that's in all of our templates, whether it's for marketing, whether it's for product templates. So I'm really glad that you named it that way because we talk about it as in cohorts as well.
Amazing.
Um, yeah, let's talk about testing. When I'm starting my content strategy, when I'm starting to experiment, maybe I've only done blog posts and a few things in my community, and I want to start experimenting with new types of content, maybe weekly videos, maybe hangout sessions, maybe I want to do Q&A in my community, etc., etc. How can I test if the content is working? How long should I test for it? Do I measure the same metrics? Do I do like qualitative or quantitative, feedback after to know if this works? What's the best way to kind of test and experiment fastly so we know if it's working?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think a good way to think about this in general is using the idea of leading and lagging indicators. And if I can kind of hook this back into what I've spoken about already, the leading indicator is the community engagement metrics. So generally, I mean, I'm simplifying, but how many people attended, how many people registered, whatever, how many people commented on this might be a leading indicator that there's an impact on your top level business outcome. So I would say if you're testing a new community initiative for like 30 days, I wouldn't really expect to see that's going to have like a cohort analysis business impact to it. It's too short to figure that out. But I might be like, okay, no one attended. So there's no potential for it to even impact the business. So I honestly, that's where, and that's why I'm not for minimizing engagement metrics and calling them vanity metrics, because they're useful in that way. Like it's useful to look at it and just be like, has this even created potential for impact because people are engaging with it? So yeah, look at those first for the first 30 days and then maybe expect to see 6 months later. Another thing to keep in mind though is beg, borrow, and steal from other communities. So
Hmm.
a lot of times I'm not really like looking to have a new idea from scratch and then totally test it. Like I have no idea whether this is going to work. I might be borrowing something that somebody said in a similar community setup was working for them. And that has been the backbone of my community professional development. Is just I talk to community builders a lot and I ask them about the projects that they're doing. So do that and then see whether you can replicate their results rather than being like, I'm starting from completely zero.
Mm, yeah, we call it the industry best practices.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But I like that. I think that taking inspiration and learning from others what worked and what doesn't can not only help you get like that one step ahead of not making the same mistake, but also not get too caught up in this idea of we can do anything. We can be super creative because then you can get very overwhelmed, right? And as you said on the beginning, we want to start small and easy in a manageable way, not produce too much and measure first.
Really.
So yeah, 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 absolutely. Wonderful. Well, I have last two questions, and then we have a few questions in registrations and also a bunch in the chat. So I want to hop into those as well. Um, I kind of started this a little bit, but content calendars, right? That's the thing we always think about. It's the beginning of the month. We need to plan out our content calendar. We need to keep up with it. How do you approach creating a content calendar for your community? And are there any like special ways that we can make sure that the calendar is like reflecting the engagement it's been getting in the past month, right? That I'm not just like creating it blindly without like considering community's feedback. It's kind of two-part question, but yeah, how can I start with the community calendar? That's the first thing.
I think that one aspect of this is frankly personality driven. Some of the community builders that I work with are just like their working style, they're much more able to take a set of constraints. So like they may have only done what I described earlier of saying like, I'm going to do 3 engagement prompts this week, and I'm going to do a weekly Q&A, and then I'm going to plan one event this month. And that's like basically their content calendar is just this set of constraints. And then they feel capable of going into the community throughout the week and sort of responding to what is happening there and producing content in that way, in that super kind of casual way. That does not work for me because I have like blank page itis, where if I
Mm-hmm.
don't have a plan in front of me, then I will basically bail and not, I'll be like, I didn't have a plan for today, so I'm not going to post something. So for me, I have to, at a minimum, sort of choose what some of the themes that I'm going to be touching on, even if I'm not writing all of the copy in advance. So I guess what I'm circling around, or what I'm getting at here, is that be honest with yourself about what is the level of planning that I need to do in advance that is going to support me to actually execute the calendar on a day-to-day basis, to actually publish this content. And that might be as little as what I described, or it might be as much as pre-writing and scheduling posts. So
Mm-hmm.
be, self-aware there. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I also would say I have a slight preference for at least laying out the themes on a calendar, because of what you're talking about, Clara, of getting this like bird's eye view of, I've planned to talk about these 3 different themes throughout this month. And then I at least have some strategic bird's eye view to then say, did those themes resonate or not? Which I think we lose a little bit of that analytical ability if we go totally week to week. And
Mm-hmm.
if we plan too far in advance. So I think I would also discourage you from planning 6 months of content in advance. So laying out like, this is my hypothesis for the month, and I'm really being a little bit intentional about what I'm planning on doing, and I'm going to try to go back and check whether that worked at the end, is what I would do. And again, the level of analysis that you feel you personally need there might vary. So like if I were working at a big organization, I don't know that I would necessarily find it useful to like report out, like create a whole report on my content calendar, and these are the things that got different level of engagement. To me, that feels like the juice isn't quite worth the squeeze, unless maybe it's totally automated, then I might do
Mm-hmm.
it. But it would be worth taking like an hour and just like reflecting on, this is what I intended to do with this content calendar. And I feel that the content calendar worked in this way or not in others. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes like gut check is almost enough there to say, I know that people attended the events and didn't really respond to my questions. You probably already know that without like pulling the report and writing down the
Yeah.
numbers. So
Yeah. Yeah. That's super interesting. And I think that you're exactly right. It really depends on your working style and on personality type and that visual. Would you mind giving us like a few examples of like tools where you can actually create content calendars? Or like, have you come across any in your career where have you just used like maybe your Google or your Outlook calendar for it and just like put it all in your personal calendar? Or have you tried like anything else? Just so we have like a few examples for our audience.
Um, I would say, if it depends on the size of organization you're working at. If you are working at an organization that has a project management tool, generally my advice would be use that tool no matter how bad it is for you. So like the worst case scenario would be, sorry, Atlassian, I love you, but community builders hate to work in Jira. But if your organization is using Jira, lay it out there, because then you have the opportunity to collaborate with the
Mhm.
product team is here already. And if I want to loop them into a card and one of my pieces of content has to do with them, then you are connected in that place. To me, I like using Asana.
Mhm.
Just works with my mind. It makes my heart sing. So I'm happy to do that in an organization. I am also a spreadsheet girly. So what I'm honestly most likely to do, if I had no constraints and I didn't feel like I had to make it sort of like public and connected to project management, I would be most likely to set up a tab on a spreadsheet, because then I have a lot of flexibility in terms of
Hmm.
adding, a different segment of the community that's going to get a different content calendar, or, color coding. It's just pretty like responsive and easy for me to do. So that's what I
Hmm.
tend to do.
Hmm. Amazing.
And
That's
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 the
super helpful.
format of my templates too, is spreadsheets, but it
Hmm.
kills some people's brains.
But I think it's a good way to get started, right? And once you kind of get the logic of it, you can always kind of translate it to your Jira, Asana, Trello, Notion, whatever platform you thrive in, or maybe it's just your Google Calendar. But then you can kind of work with it a little easier as well. Amazing. Well, we have a bunch of questions here, so I'm going to hop into them. Um, the first question I wanted to read out was from Calgary. And the question is, how do you differentiate your content from similar content that's already out there? So let's say
Oh,
maybe you want to innovate a little bit or you feel like you should capture that content. How can you differentiate?
yes. So this is like a belief that I formed when I worked at Teachable. I do not believe, or I don't actually care too much about content duplication. Sorry, across my brand versus someone else's, or even in my own brand. So there are places where some of my content, like I teach a course in a community that a lot of the content, I have a very robust blog. So I guess if somebody wanted to, like, could go through and learn like everything that I think about those topics without entering the course. But I think a lot of times what people are paying for or going through friction for is like the organization that you put into something, or how you kind of frame something.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, and to kind of justify or give evidence for that point of view, I just think that people are choosing content not based off of the actual information. They are maybe choosing it based off of the form of delivery, or the person, the relationship that they have with them, the way that they convey it. So I think I would just try to sort of trust that, even if somebody else has already written about this topic, like my way of writing about it might be different. Um, that might be wrong if you're a huge business, but if you're running a smaller business that has a kind of strong brand identity, then it tends to be okay if there's some overlap
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
to that.
Um, yeah, yeah. Um, Yeah, that makes total sense. In another question that I'm reading here, Kagri asked us a little bit about how do you test content and what are some metrics, which I think we covered. But the
Mhm.
part I would kind of like to dissect here is from the second question, which is how long should I keep producing regular piece of content or content series to see if it sticks? So how long do we keep the experiment running? Is it a month? Is it a quarter? Is it 6 months? How long should I stick with it to see like if it's working or no?
Yeah, there's a little bit of instinct in this question, I think, because um, but let me see if I can kind of make that more concrete. Like, what would my instinct be based off of? I guess I might test something for longer if my instinct told me that it was hard to do or
Mm,
hard to understand. Like, if I feel that I'm running something new and I feel really confident that it's a match for my audience, like maybe I did a ton of user research beforehand and I know that what I'm offering is a fit for the audience, but that they may need to like block out time on their calendar to do it, or there might be some other source of friction, then I might test it out for longer and try some different interventions to make it work. On the flip side, if I was like totally throwing a piece of spaghetti at the wall and I had no idea, I have never asked anyone whether they want this or not, and I'm not super confident in it, um, and it's the easiest thing in the world to do. So like an example might be, I've decided I'm going to test putting polls in my community, right? Then, and nobody responds to a poll that I've put in every week for a month, then I might be like, okay, that didn't work, right? There's no real reason why they wouldn't have done it that I need to kind of solve. So I would say use a little bit of kind of instinct and reasoning around the level of difficulty. And as I'm getting into this too, I'm realizing an aspect of this is that we can choose to do more research or we can choose to do shorter tests. So If you are somebody who doesn't like to do little tests, then one way to kind of get around that is to try to do a ton of research in advance to validate all of your ideas so that they have a better chance of working. If you're someone who doesn't like to do that, then you can do that research by just offering things.
Yep, absolutely. And I think one last thing I kind of thought of, and I think as
Mm.
you mentioned, right, like you can kind of feel it out a little bit, but I think also the circumstances are really crucial, right? Maybe you started testing this experiment during the summer. Maybe your community is a little bit logged off during the summer. Maybe it was during the holidays, right? Or maybe you determine that there are certain topics, maybe even in those polls, which was actually an example that happened in my community when
Mm.
we posted polls that had like a specific angle, when we found out how others do this type of activity. Everybody was interested, but when it was like more exploratory on like other areas, they didn't care. So we realized, oh, it's not the poll as it is, it's that like niche, that nuance that we like zoomed in that time, right? Maybe you're running Q&As with leaders, but maybe everyone's interested in hearing from your leaders with a diverse background, or maybe leaders that are in tech but don't code, right? So maybe it's that it could be the niche as well, right? So maybe it's not that the whole
Yes.
experiment is doomed, maybe it's just a part of it, right? And then you find out and make it better. Yeah.
100%. And yeah, Clara is like demonstrating strategic thinking live because
Oh.
what what you're doing is breaking down like, could it be this? Could it be this? What are the different aspects of this? There's the format, there's the time of day, there's like the seasonality, there's the topic, the niche, the phrasing of the question. Like there's so many different aspects to it. So I think that's such a nice way to think of it. Um,
Hmm.
just like poke at what the different areas are until you feel satisfied. Like, no, I'm pretty sure it's not any of these things and that people just didn't like the poll
Hmm.
or try
Yeah.
one of the other. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I know we're already a few minutes over, but if it's okay, I have one last question I wanted to ask you. Amazing. We got a question from Grace from registrations, and the question was around creating community content. I think it can be, it's pretty time consuming to create a lot of good, high quality, engaging content. Do you have any like secret tips for us on how to maybe do it faster, or how can we outsource, or how can we just create more content without putting all the extra work in? Is there a hack, or do we just have to do it?
Um, delegate. I want to say delegate, but I want to be careful to say, and what I mean, delegate to community members. So
Hmm.
in an ideal world, we are not the ones running the content calendar forever. We are actually creating a sort of skeleton for what we want to be happening organically in our communities. And then those things just begin to happen without our intervention. But I don't want to overstate that that's exactly easy either, because I think getting to the point where you've created leadership in another person where they've taken something over is an investment of time as well. It's just maybe a more worthy time investment. So I think what I would say is if you feel like I've reached a cap on the amount of time that I have to put into putting on a Q&A, then maybe what you would do is try to reinvest that time into developing other leaders of the Q&A, but you would know that it's still going to take another 6 months or so probably before they are in total autonomy with the program.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And we have a quick comment in
Totally.
our chat as well, which is rather than creating content, it's curating content. And I
Yes.
and I love that. That's exactly right, right? You kind of teach the community how to then help you and like be a part of it. I think another part is if your community maybe may not be there yet, where it's very like self-sufficient, you can create opportunities for folks to like actively contribute and like work with you on pieces of content. Maybe before folks start creating on their own, you can kind of like
Mm.
pave the path for them a little bit as well. Because I don't think it's never a jump from us kind of as community builders, practitioners, creating content and then all of a sudden, or all the articles write themselves, right? It's always a step by step process.
Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, Noel, thank you so much for joining us today, for sharing all of your insights with us. This was an amazing session, and huge thank you to our audience as well for being again great in the chat and conversing with us so much. I know that Noel had a few resources that she promised us that she would share, which was a link to her template library, and I think you also had another resource that you wanted to share with us. Is that right?
Yeah, so the thing that I really want to plug here is I am running an engagement mini challenge for a week in my community of community builders. It's $50, $10 a day to participate. And I'm like in sales mode, so I'm sorry about that, but I really do think that it's good. It's going to be an engagement workshop, and then each day a kind of focused engagement on different segments of your community. So looking at how can I engage people that are already here, that are already maybe like super users that need to be elevated into a leadership position versus people that are not showing up at all. And we're going to be kind of focusing on those different segments and then spinning them into a larger engagement plan. And I am offering for Black Friday that with my template library included, which is usually $100. So this is like probably the best deal I've ever done, but I just want to meet people, so I'm offering it.
Mm-hmm.
It's more important to me for y'all to come into the challenge. And then I also just always like to offer something free too, which is just my blog. Really, Clara already shared that, but good opportunity to kind of read on a lot of these different topics. I have stuff about ROI that we talked about, stuff about community content, all of those things. So hopefully, whatever your way is, I'd love for you to kind of stay in touch with me, and maybe I'll see some of you in the challenge.
Absolutely. I think it's a great resource, and I can vouch that we've actually pulled from your blog for our kind of brainstorms in our monthly newsletter, and even as like resources we read. I think we've shared already a couple times some of the content that you have created. And what I love about Noah's content is that it's always it's very high level, but then you have concrete examples of how you can really learn to think about things your way, right? And get into that like mindset of how can I like apply this to my community, which I think is super important.
Thank
So
you.
I've shared, of course, we thank you for all the great resources. I have shared all of the links in the chat, Noel's LinkedIn, the weekly challenge, and the blog. And last but not least, I'm going to share a link to our events. We have two more events until the end of the year, and then we're done. We had a super busy event season of over, I believe, 35 events we've done so far, which I think in our community, in our small community, is quite a huge number. This was our last community skills event of the year. So Noel, thank you so much for being our final speaker for this year. It was such a great session. I'm really excited for the recap. I'm excited to share the recording with our community, and we thank you for your time.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, and nice to meet everybody. Stay in touch.
All right, thank you everyone for joining. Have a great rest of your day.
Talk soon. Bye-bye.